The boundaries of kayfabe have changed tremendously over the years, evolving from a sacred code punishable by a total blacklisting from professional wrestling to kind of just like a guideline. Nowadays, kayfabe is a free-flowing thing, with wrestlers encouraged to push it whenever a storyline can benefit. In the good old days, however, it was a big deal for someone to acknowledge the scripted nature of pro wrestling on air. It was talked about for weeks afterwards. Some of these character-breaking acts have gained tremendous amounts of notoriety over years, such as CM Punk's infamous pipe bomb, or any number of WCW wrestlers' worked shoots during Vince Russo's reign. Trust me, all of those were terrible. But many others have flown under the radar, either because they weren't quite as in your face about it, or because they were overshadowed by something else that happened that night. So let's dust off some of those kayfabe breaking moments that never got their due time in the spotlight and release them back into the wild. However, if pro wrestling is still real to you, damn it, then you may want to brace yourself for what's about to unfold. I'm Simon from WhatCulture. This is 10 times you forgot pro wrestlers broke kayfabe on the air. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to stay notified. Ding, ding, done. Number 10. Mankind buries the people's elbow. Remember how Hulk Hogan became somehow impervious to moves that would have ordinarily taken him off his feet after he hulked up? That's basically an extremely exaggerated version of a no-sell. But at least in the Hulkster's case, his refusal to react to his opponent's strikes like an actual human being was still within the confines of kayfabe. That wasn't the case when Mick Foley decided to mock the most electrifying move in sports entertainment during his heated rivalry with the Great One. Leading up to his triple threat match against the People's Champ and Ken Shamrock at Breakdown, Foley, as Mankind, offered an uncharacteristically blunt assessment of a certain over-the-top and woefully unrealistic finishing move. He said, "Of all the stupid things I've seen in my life, nothing rivals the people's elbow. So if you think that Mankind in a pay-per-view match inside the steel cage is going to lay down and sell that abortion, well, you're even stupider than I look." Insider talk like that was pushed to the forefront during Russo's tenure as WWE's head writer, but most fans weren't really in on it in those days. As for the legitimacy of Mankind's statement, when it did indeed come time to take the people's elbow in the match later that night, he did. And in fact, he sold it pretty nicely. Number 9. Triple H stops a real-life attacker from beating up his mother-in-law. In the Wild West days of the Attitude Era, fans made a nasty habit of trying to get on the action and step in front of the camera. It just wasn't a wrestling show unless someone hopped the barricade and tried to bum rush a superstar. As a tangent, never do this. Whenever that does happen, all bets were off. If security weren't fast enough to corral them, wrestlers were given carte blanche to take care of the situation if they felt threatened. It's only fair. And this is exactly what happened when a crazed audience member made a run at Linda McMahon during an episode of Raw. For some context, this was during the height of the McMahon-Helmsley era, when Linda was the only babyface in the entire McMahon family. As such, Triple H was not on her list of favourite people, and in a rare TV appearance, she was telling him just that. But when a rogue fan started running towards Linda, Hunter instinctively ran up the ramp and tackled him to the ground before, presumably, laying into him with some sturdy right hands. The cameraman, along with an obviously terrified Linda, had no idea what the hell was going on and wasn't quick enough to cut away from the scene. Commentary has always ignored this situation, as is the protocol, but the WWF fans knew what they saw, and it certainly wasn't part of the storyline. Number 8. Terry Funk thinks Mick Foley just died. The 1998 Hell in a Cell match between The Undertaker and Mankind is primarily remembered for one thing: the sight of Mick Foley being launched off the top of the cage and torpedoing down onto the announce table while JR insisted he was dead, or had been broken in half. That incredibly ballsy stunt gets much of the recognition, and with good reason. Fewer people talk about the second spot though, which featured The Undertaker choke slamming Foley through the cage ceiling and onto the mat 20 feet below. And even fewer people than that talk about the fact that Terry Funk, who was still knee-deep in a feud with Foley at the time, broke kayfabe completely by storming down to the ring with the paramedics to check on his friend, who he thought had just been murdered on live television. Clad in the kind of clothes your old uncle wears when he goes to the park to throw rocks at birds, Funk was one of the first guys down the ramp to check on him. JR, of course, tried to explain this by saying that even enemies have a bond that transcends near-death experiences, but he's too wondering if Mick still has a pulse to actually sell this. Funk even upped the ante by engaging in some fisticuffs with Taker later in the match, just to give Foley an extra minute to recover from what can only have been heaps of trauma. Number 7. CHAZ rejects his beaver cleavage gimmick. As one half of the Headbangers, Charles Warrington, better known as Mosh, was for a brief time pretty over with fans. But as their metal-loving, skirt-wearing gimmick wore thin and his tag partner Thrasher suffered a knee injury, Mosh was repackaged as a mother-loving, beanie-wearing reincarnate of 50s sitcom staple Beaver Cleaver. And when I say mother-loving, I don't mean that he held her in high regard and set her a card every year on her birthday. I mean, he literally wanted to have sex with her I hate wrestling. To recap, Beaver Cleavage, and isn't that hilarious, was essentially a 30-year-old man playing the part of a 250-pound 7-year-old who was sexually obsessed with his own mum's boobs. If there ever was a time to break kayfabe and denounce a ridiculous storyline, well, this was certainly that time. That's basically what happened. Warrington stopped an interview dead in its track after yet another double entendre declaring, "I can't do this," before storming off the live broadcast, supposedly bewildering the interviewer and the commentators. He came back the next week with a work shoot in which he bashed the tasteless gimmick and the writers behind it. He then reintroduced himself under his real name CHAZ and brought out the woman who had played his mother in the vignettes, but now said she was his girlfriend. This was absolutely rubbish. Number 6, everyone thinks Undertaker is taking his gimmick too seriously. In the world of pro wrestling, gimmicks used to be kind of a big deal. They were the primary method of differentiating one wrestler from another, and superstars simply did not break character. So, for example, if your gimmick is that you're an undead superhuman capable of teleportation and summoning lightning from your hands, you dove headlong into your mystical personality, and you damn well never looked back. During the Attitude Era, however, Vince McMahon decided to say hell with that and let the whole WWE universe know that you shouldn't be taking these gimmicks too seriously, even one that's been represented on television as real for the better part of a decade. So when The Undertaker morphed into a satanic cult leader and started crucifying people, there was a lot of on-air chatter about how Mark Calloway was becoming too far removed from reality and actually believed he was now The Undertaker, which, for those keeping the score at home, is kind of the whole point of what a gimmick is. Several performers then started to refer to him as Mark during promos, including Vince himself, Stephanie McMahon and Ken Shamrock, and pleaded with him to get a grip on reality and stop that whole cult nonsense. This went on for weeks, though no one ever called attention to the fact that Mark was being tossed around more than brother in a Hulk Hogan promo. But eventually, Taker acquiesced, because of course he did. Number 5, The Undertaker shoots on Vince McMahon. So we just covered the rather odd time during Undertaker's Lord of Darkness phase when everyone kept begging him, on screen, to stop taking kayfabe so seriously. But now let's talk about the time he did just that, delivering a strange blend of fact and fiction in a 1998 work shoot. Decked out as if he'd just come from the cinema, something I cannot forgive today given I love The Undertaker, Mark Calloway went out in front of the Raw audience and lodged every complaint he had with Vince McMahon since the day he stepped into the company. He pointed out how McMahon basically used him as an enhancement talent for the bulk of his career, while his more wholesome, hand-picked champions were chosen to represent the company. And while he was recalling his own championship reigns, he delivered this damning blow, and I quote, "Oh yes, I am a 2-time former World Wrestling Federation champion, but as you all know, my tenures in champion, they didn't last very long. Why? Here's why." He didn't say that, I put it in. Because Vince McMahon didn't want someone like The Undertaker representing the World Wrestling Federation. And then from nowhere, he curiously enough dipped slightly back into character and referenced his feuds with his brother Kane and how Vince exploited his family tragedies. And remember, none of that was real. Kane, who is Glenn Jacobs, isn't even Mark Calloway, who is The Undertaker's brother, so that's all nonsense. This makes this momentary lapse of kayfabe even more perplexing, but ultimately, maybe it was quite effective. It's almost as if Vince told him, you can go out there and talk as much trash about me as you want, as long as you bring it back into the storyline somehow. So that's what he did. Number 4, Zeus comes out of the movies to feud with Hulk Hogan. Here's an example that shows Vince McMahon was fine with breaking kayfabe long before groups like the NWO and DX made it a cool thing to do. Although it's kind of clear Vince didn't exactly understand what he was doing or how to do it at the time. For the uninitiated, No Holds Barred was a laughably terrible movie that flopped hard at the box office and is best remembered for a scene in which Hulk Hogan makes a grown man soil his pants. In the film, Hogan plays the heavyweight champion of the World Wrestling Federation, except in the movie, his name isn't Hulk Hogan, it's Rip Thomas. No one actually knows why this is, but this name change created a very strange paradox when the WWE decided to bring the movie's big bad villain, that would be Zeus, in for a match against Hogan at SummerSlam. In the storyline, Zeus came into the real world to challenge Hogan to a match because he was upset about losing to Hogan's character Rip in the movie. Again, this isn't the actor Tiny Lister who played the Zeus character challenging the Hulkster, it's a purely fictitious character crashing the real-life version of the WWE to challenge a real person who previously wrestled him as a fictional character. And yes, I actually said that sentence, and it barely makes any sense. Luckily for Vince, the whole thing was so damn confusing that no one seemed to notice him crapping all over kayfabe back when that was still a big no-no. Number 3, DX replays the curtain call. If you're a WWE fan who somehow still hasn't seen or heard of the infamous curtain call incident at Madison Square Garden, Well, just go and Google it now. Then you'll understand all of this. Much has been made of Vince McMahon's displeasure towards those involved in the MSG incident, and the subsequent wrath fell upon Triple H, who was the only participant not leaving for WCW or wearing the WWE Championship. Hunter's momentum came to a screeching halt, and as he put it, they did everything they could to screw with me. This included dropping all of his main event spots, making him work with jobbers, and cutting his storylines to practically nothing. That is a mighty hard way to learn about respecting wrestling's oldest tradition. Fast forward a little more than a year later, and the guidelines regarding kayfabe had changed drastically thanks to, ironically, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash's constant line blurring with the NWO. DX was always trying to one-up their former clique mates, so they decided to super kick that fourth wall right to the ground by showing the infamous curtain call footage during an episode of Raw. They also mocked anyone who took the incident too seriously because apparently Triple H hadn't learned his lesson. Meanwhile, McMahon, sitting ringside at the announcers table, looked genuinely pissed about his two clown princes shattering kayfabe into bits before his eyes. It seemed that wound was still a little too fresh. Number 2, Goldberg refuses to do business. Toward the end of its run, WCW couldn't go 10 minutes without swerving or shooting or just outright uppercutting kayfabe in the beanbags. Most of these incidences are well documented, but for some reason, not many folks talk about one of the worst examples of how not to blur the lines. New Blood Rising was supposed to be a turning point for WCW. It was meant to be an event the company proved it could run without Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff, both of whom had left the month before. Instead, it showed the world why Vince Russo shouldn't be in charge without a babysitter. During a triple threat match between Goldberg, Kevin Nash and Scott Steiner, Goldberg, for some reason, didn't show up until 5 minutes into the match. He then walked out of said match after another 5 minutes because he refused to take a jackknife powerbomb from Nash. It was awkward. Rather than try to make it look like it was part of a work, the three commentators spent the rest of the match blathering on about how Goldberg had just refused to do business. Tony Schiavone even said this: "Let's see what's going to happen now. If in fact the jackknife powerbomb was part of the design, what are they going to do? Improvise?" But they also made constant references to the storyline surrounding the match, treating them as if it was real. So which is it, guys? Do you want to be edgy and kayfabe less, or do you want to call the match as if it actually matters? You can't have it both ways, and you certainly can't expect your viewers to care about the outcome of the match after that. Either way, once again, this sucked. Number 1, Vince flat out tells everyone pro wrestling isn't real. Yeah, that's right. Vince McMahon practically introduced the concept of shattering kayfabe during a promo for the newly rebranded Attitude Era. To get out of paying taxes that all pure sports-based organizations have to pay, Vince adopted the sports entertainment name to describe his programming. This was way back in 1999. The language he used to define this new term was a little vague. So when it came time to introduce his edgier, more realistic product, he stood in front of a camera and confirmed to the world what most people had already suspected: pro wrestling is fake. Vince said, "Even though we call ourselves sports entertainment because of the athleticism involved, the key word in that phrase is entertainment. The WWF extends far beyond the strict confines of sports presentation into the wide open environment of broad-based entertainment." So the translation of what he was saying was, "We're not an actual sport, you fools. Our matches are predetermined. We're just like every other fictional TV show." He then went on to compare the WWF to soap operas, music videos, daytime talk shows, sitcoms, and even cartoons. Vince was delivering a solid, assured slap to the face of his predecessors and to anyone who took his programming too seriously. One of his most famous lines was, "We in the WWF think that you, the audience, are quite frankly tired of having your intelligence insulted." And yes, that meant you're an idiot if you still think what we do isn't scripted. Stop being such a schmuck.
Oh, wasn't that something? Don't forget to like, share and subscribe below, and also the people who made this lovely video, they're appearing right here. But if you're thinking to yourself, I want to see more content, Jules, then why not look above my head, as there probably is some. I don't know. I can't see it. Until next time.